Hello, welcome to Humanity 130, Society and Finance. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 3, Corporate Crime. I am the product of an abused childhood. My parents were always throwing money at me. So he is suffering from affluenza, something that a lot of rich kids are claiming these days. So let's review what is corporate crime. Corporate crime are illegal acts committed by employees or officers of a corporation to promote corporate or personal interests. And as we've talked about in class, we've talked about Enron, Tyco, and Arthur Andersen, and how most of these companies are no longer in business because the CEO or CFO have finagled the books and caused the companies to go bankrupt. So let's start with a little history of corporate crime. One of the first corporations in history came out of the shipping trade in the 16 and 1700s. And essentially what came about from these shipping companies was the devastation of the American Indians and the development and spread of the slave trade throughout Africa and then well into the West Indies and the United States. So we don't really think of that as corporate crime, but what they were doing was, in a sense, looking at how to make money off of something that was not legal at the time and became normal instead of legal. And there's a difference. So we're going to jump ahead to the era of the Industrial Revolution, which occurred in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and evolved through the 1800s into the 1900s. And we have the emergence of manufacturing. So what crimes were committed? We had fraud, we had stock manipulation, we had price fixing, we had exploitation of labor, especially children. Child labor at this time was extremely prevalent. The picture on the top right you'll see is a young girl, probably around age 8, and they would carry lumber and coal through these small shafts that were built in buildings that were so small because they had children who could carry these buckets of coal and wood through from various parts of the building. The picture below shows a series of young boys, probably most of them in the 10 to 12 years range, whose job it was to move pipes around. And again, what you saw is that it wasn't illegal at the time, but they were being exploited. And until the advent of child labor laws, these things weren't necessarily illegal, but they were immoral. Unsafe working conditions. One of the most famous events was the Triangle Factory Fire, where young women in New York were locked into the Triangle Factory sewing, and there was a fire, and they perished. Over 100 young women died because they couldn't get out of the building because they were locked in. So you saw a lot of these unsafe working conditions. And then, of course, you had the monopolies. People like the Rockefellers were running monopolies with their oil and gas interests. And, nowadays we think of these families as having built the United States, and they did to a big extent. However, they were also building the United States using this monopoly power. So a lot of these crimes that were being committed were not illegal until people realized that they were in fact crimes. So before we go any further, let's talk about corporations in the modern era. And let's talk about the definition. A corporation is defined as a group of people authorized by law to act as a legal personality having its own powers, duties, and liabilities. Keeping in mind that a few years ago, the Supreme Court did in fact hold that a corporation can be defined as a person capable of free speech, which allows it to make political donations to candidates that it supports in political campaigns. So that was an interesting dynamic for a lot of people to see that corporations have the same rights as individuals. So some of our more famous corporations out there are the Walt Disney Company, the Target Bullseye, and of course everyone's favorite fast food, McDonald's. In the United States, the economic system is an example of free market capitalism. Free market is defined as an economy in which the forces of supply and demand are not controlled by a government or other authority. This also presupposes that there is no corruption involved. There is no price fixing, there's no fraud. Capitalism is defined as an economic system in which industry is controlled by non-government owners with the goal of making profits. And again, this system is based on the idea that there is no fraudulent activity going on. Now, as you can probably imagine, the big problem with free market capitalism is that there is an epidemic of fraud. And a large part of this class, and specifically this chapter, is based on the fact that there is so much fraud that the concept of free market capitalism is really, underscored by this undercurrent of fraud throughout the entire system. And as such, 75% of Americans have a very negative view of corporations because they are seen as dehumanizing people in pursuit of profit. In other words, money is more important than people. So as a consequence to a lot of the issues that we have seen with fraud and other corporate crime, the vast majority of Americans neither trust nor appreciate the value of free market capitalism. So who manages the corporations? Well, it's usually the president of the company, the chief executive officer, the chairman of the board. And we'll go into who these people are in more detail later. But these folks have usually earned or purchased large amounts of corporation stock, and they often manage a company to increase the stock price, not necessarily to make the company a better company or to make a better product, but to increase the stock price. And then the question then becomes, is there a conflict of interest between what is best for the company and what is best for the stockholders? And as you saw in the Enron documentary, this is not the same thing. So a company that makes a product may want to have a certain product made a certain way, but it's too expensive. So they decide to send it off to a third world country to make it much, much cheaper, which will make the product much less quality, but the stock price will soar because the expenses go down, which makes the balance sheet look great. So, there's a lot of different dynamics within the world of corporate decision making, and there is the competing forces of, do we want a great product or do we want the stock price to continue to go up? And unless you have a company that really is much like a Disney, you don't see the combination of stock price and quality often married together. Who owns the corporation? Well, we've talked about this, and it's the people who own the stock. So, for example, there are approximately 1 billion, with a B, shares of McDonald's stock. Now, you would think, wow, that's a lot of people owning a lot of stock. But overall, only about 1% of the total population in the United States owns about 50% of the stock in American corporations. Recently, in 2016, the numbers came out that the 62 wealthiest people in the world have more money than 3.5 billion, with a B, people in the world. So the divide between the very, very rich and everyone else keeps growing. And that is, again, this income inequality becomes very evident when we look at these numbers. So we're going to look at the United States for a few minutes in terms of the wealth. The wealthiest 10% of Americans own 90% of the stock available. The wealthiest 1% of the American population controls 1/3 or 33% of the total net worth in the United States. So there's about 330 million people going around in the United States. So that means about 3 million people own 1/3 of all the money in the United States. These are some of the richest people in the United States that are on this chart here. You have Bill Gates up in Washington, Phil Knight in Oregon, he owns Nike, Larry Ellison in California, he is a big IT entrepreneur, Sheldon Adelstein in Nevada is a gambling magnate. David Koch runs Koch Industries along with his brother. They're very involved in politics. Michael Dell, of course, IT. James Walton, he and his siblings are some of the richest people in the country and one of the largest employers. And a lot of their employees utilize food stamps and welfare because most of their employees, of course, what kind of money do they earn? Yes, they earn minimum wage. Warren Buffett is the guy who made $1 gazillion through investments. Michael Bloomberg owns Bloomberg News. He was the mayor of New York City. And Forrest Mars is the guy who runs the candy company. So he has his candy shop, so to speak. Another option out there in the world is called an oligopoly. And this is when a relatively few corporations control the marketplace. We live right outside of the Philadelphia area, and for the vast majority of us, we have a total of 2 options to get cable television. We have Comcast, that charges an arm and a leg, and Verizon, that charges an arm and a leg. Some areas we have DirecTV, but for the vast majority of us, we have 2 options, both of which are very expensive. Now, if you live in another part of the country, for example, Florida, you might have 8 or 9 options, all of which are much more affordable. And this is a scenario that you see all over the country with various industries, where you don't have a lot of competition. The prices just seem to be unbelievably high. And as a consequence to that, people don't even want to get into the marketplace to try and compete because, if they try and compete, they're going to get pushed out by the big boys who have a ton of money to advertise out the wazoo. We have these conglomerates that you probably know a huge number of these products. Conglomerates are a group of companies operating in different markets, but who are controlled by a centralized owner. For example, Procter & Gamble controls all of these brands. That's right, one company controls all of these brands. So you see Iams, Downy, Braun, Max Factor, Pantene, Old Spice, CoverGirl, Vicks, Zest, Aussie, Tide, Olay, Febreze, Nice and Easy, Clairol, Mr. Clean, Crest. All of these products, and they do indeed compete against one another. But that is the idea, is that if you decide, you know what, I've been using CoverGirl or Clairol all my life or Max Factor, I'm going to try a different product. Ooh, I'll try Nice and Easy. Well, they're not going to lose any money because even though you feel like you want to make a change, you're still putting your money in the same company. So one of your favorite brands is probably controlled by a conglomerate. We think we have choice, but really what we're seeing is that the vast majority of all of these choices is controlled by one of 10 companies. So if you look at Coca-Cola, for example, you have all of these sodas that we think are different, but are really the same. But look at a company like Johnson & Johnson. You have a lot of different medications. You have Sudafed, you have Benadryl, you have Pepcid, you have Tylenol. They're all the same company. And as we looked at Procter & Gamble, now look at Nestle. Nestle is huge, huge. Look at all of the different products that they have, especially in terms of the baby items. They have Gerber, they have Carnation. Then they have clothes, Yves Saint Laurent, Ralph Lauren, Diesel. They have cat food, dog food. They have all kinds of stuff in that neighborhood. PepsiCo is another huge company. A&W, Taco Bell, KFC, Pizza Hut, Eastside Mario's. So when we look at these choices that we have to remember that these choices are false choices in a lot of ways, because ultimately they're all owned by the same 8-9 companies. When we look at the term transgressions, we have to think that these are activities that are harmful but not necessarily illegal. So, for example, some companies legally evade paying taxes by shifting profits to subsidiaries in countries with favorable, i.e., low tax policies. So, for example, Microsoft Corporation has shifted its intellectual property, a mobile asset, to subsidiaries in Puerto Rico, Ireland, and Singapore, which are low or no tax jurisdictions, in part to avoid or reduce its U.S. taxes on the profits generated by assets sold by its offshore entities. In other words, they take its intellectual property, meaning its patent, which is the mobile asset. You can pick it up and take it to another country and, register it in Ireland, and now it doesn't get taxed at the same rate. So you're not paying American taxes on it. Well, Bill Gates lives where? In the United States. And he's generally seen as an awesome guy. Gives most of his money to charity. But the corporation itself is finagling this so that it doesn't have to pay as much tax. Ultimately, most corporations see it as a sport. How do we pay less tax? So let's look at the different types of corporate crime. We have corporate violence, corporate corruption and fraud, corporate stealing, and corporate deception. So let's start with corporate violence. Corporate violence results from policies and actions undertaken by the management of the corporation that results in consumers being exposed to harmful products or conditions. It is usually motivated by the desire to maximize corporate profits. So, for example, the tobacco industry hid medical reports that smoking causes cancer for decades before a whistleblower revealed the research. And, this was something that the tobacco companies rejected for decades. They said there is no research that demonstrates that smoking causes cancer. And they proclaimed this from the mountain for years. And then it wasn't until the late 1970s, early 1980s, that somebody came forward and said, not only does the research show it, but the smoking industry, the tobacco industry, knew it and hid the information, which is why there was such a backlash. Other examples of corporate violence include the unsafe disposal of toxic waste and unchecked pollutants being released into the air and water. So the consequences include the rise in cancer rates in the 20th century, the rise in lung-related diseases, and the rise in birth defects and genetic disorders. We as a society tend to pay more attention to things like the Super Bowl than we do to oil spills or toxic waste dumps. Things like that tend to enrage us for a week and then we move on. Other corporate violence issues include unsafe products, such as food. Upton Sinclair in the early 20th century wrote a book about the food industry and the meatpacking industry in Chicago called The Jungle. And it was horrifying to people. Body parts would get cut off of the workers and they would get mixed in with the ground meat. And they didn't stop the production line. It would just get mixed in. Bugs and rats were mixed in. To this day, the USDA allows a certain amount of bug parts to go into your hot dogs. Then there's the pharmaceutical products and the medical devices. Thalidomide was a medication that was prescribed for morning sickness but caused massive birth defects. This was something in the 60s that was used in Great Britain. Babies were born without arms and legs. It was not used widely in the U.S. because it never made it through the FDA process. A drug combination that did make it through the FDA process was fen-phen in the 90s. And this was a weight loss combination drug, but it was linked to fatal lung disease and heart problems, and it was eventually pulled from the market. Unsafe transportation products. You had Ford's Pinto, and it had a gas tank in the rear, which caused the car to explode if it was rear-ended, one of the most common car accidents. The Chevy Corvair was a sports car, and its steering mechanism didn't work right, nor did its exhaust system work. More modern-day examples include the Toyota, where it has unintended acceleration. The Honda today also has problems with its airbag system. It denied it for years until the manufacturer of the airbag finally revealed that, it hasn't been working right. So you have these scenarios where, the corporations knew about this stuff, hid it until it was almost too late. Then you have the corporate violence against workers. And this is when companies display a willful indifference to the health and safety of their employees in pursuit of higher profits. So there are 3.5 million workplace injuries every year. Approximately 17 American workers die each day due to work-related injuries. Approximately 100 American employees die each year due to gross indifference or intentional wrongdoing. So, for example, exposure to chemicals or other toxic substances without proper safety clothes. This is one of those things where if you are an employee, you believe that you are due certain safety measures. As a boss or an owner, you think they're a hassle because they cost you money. It's two different perspectives. But again, the perspective is that if you go to your job and your job is to be a carpenter, you believe that you shouldn't have to risk your life putting on a roof. You should have a safety harness. So again, it's a perspective, but in a modern society, this perspective seems that we should do what we can to keep it safe. Then we have corporate corruption and fraud. These activities include financial manipulation, trademark and copyright violations, misrepresenting facts in advertisements, unfair labor practices, financial fraud, and war crimes. I want you to look at the numbers over here. Now, they're a few years old, but look at the number of fraud cases that are pending, and this is from the FBI, starting from 2007 to 2011. These are not very high numbers, and we briefly talked about it when we went over Chapter 1. These are very complex cases, and there's not a lot of law enforcement officers out there who really understand this stuff. So you don't see a lot of indictments because it's just a really confusing and complicated set of information that, quite frankly, can get tied up in litigation for decades. There is something called a corporate abuse of power. It is through lobbyists many corporations financially support political candidates. These political candidates then will help them reduce their tax liability, will help vote to deregulate their industry, and will help block any attempt to increase the minimum wage. When the politician takes office, he or she is aggressively lobbied to intervene on a corporation's behalf. So it's a circle of money. The lobbyist is hired by a corporation to intervene and speak to a politician who is either running to be elected or running to be re-elected. The lobbyist will make sure that certain donations are made. When that politician is elected or re-elected, the lobbyist will return and say, okay, I scratched your back, and now we need you to scratch our back. So it's that quid pro quo system. So over here on the right, you see making a list, checking it twice, going to vote based on you paying me nice. And unfortunately nowadays, it is so overt that generally everyone understands that our Congress and our senators are bought for by industry. So what are lobbyists? These are people who try to influence legislation on behalf of a special interest. And, lobbyists in general are not all horrible people. They're not all evil. Some of them are very evil, and some of them really do have a special interest, best interest at heart, and they're a good group of people. So, for example, you have the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons, which is, in fact, one of the largest lobbyist groups in the country. Think about all the people who are age 50 and older. American Medical Association, everyone related to the medical field. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, ExxonMobil, the oil industry, and Verizon, which is telecommunications. Then we also have something called the government no-bid contracts, which are very controversial depending on your perspective. The Department of Defense often awards multi-million-dollar no-bid contracts to a small group of huge corporations. These corporations are run by ex-politicians, ex-military leaders, and friends of politicians, which leads to a recipe for disaster. So, for example, contracts to develop parts of the healthcare.gov website were given to Avoidance, which was a subsidiary of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Florida, through a no-bid contract, meaning there was no competition. When the website went live, it was a huge mess for President Obama. When you don't have competition, you don't have the opportunity to choose the best. You are choosing what's available. And what's available could be your brother-in-law, could be the guy who your friend wants you to hire. So it's not always a good option. Now, for example, we have a company called Halliburton. And prior to 2000, it was run by Dick Cheney, who became George W. Bush's vice president in 2000. In 2002, Halliburton was fined $2 million for overcharging overcharging the military for repairs at a military base. So instead of charging somebody what the price tag was, they overcharged. Now, did they get punished? They were fined, but in 2003, Halliburton was awarded a $7 billion, with a B, no-bid contract to rebuild Iraq's oil operations. So the concept that this no-bid contract is based on is that, well, there's only a few companies that can really handle this kind of work. And even though they're crooked as the day is long, they're really the only companies that can handle it. So we're going to just stick with them. And what you then see is a handful of these companies get away with corporate malfeasance or corporate crime all the time and are still rewarded by our government by giving them these massive contracts. Here are the top 10 corporate winners in Iraq, and you'll see that KBR is a former subsidiary of Halliburton, is one of the big winners, almost $40 billion. Some of the other big winners, $1.3 billion to Blackwater, which was a private security firm and was later banned from Iraq for all the malfeasance that they perpetrated in Iraq. Some of the other companies, Dynacorp, ITT, Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, which is a state-owned oil refining company from Kuwait. And who is Kuwait's protector? The Saudis. And who are the Saudis' best friend? The United States. So we look at this and you see that there is a underground connection through all of these, and it's not supply and demand, it's not free and fair capitalism, it's not an unfettered system here. It is a connection of people who work together underneath the scenes to create these systems. Other cases by defense contractors included Lockheed Martin, Rockwell International, Boeing, Unisys, General Electric, perpetrating the following: overcharging the United States, double billing, and defrauding the Department of Defense. These companies pay fines, but they are not disqualified from getting more government contracts. So just think about this. If you had a company, like let's say that your landlord or your oil company or your telephone company was constantly overcharging you or double billing you, at some point you would say enough and you would get a different company to handle your system. But no, the government just says, no, we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to keep using this company over and over and over again. Now let's move into something even more fun: healthcare fraud. These activities involve manipulating billing codes to charge for more expensive procedures, hospitals demanding kickbacks from doctors for referrals or paying doctors for referrals. This costs the U.S. government about $100 million a year in fraudulent Medicaid and Medicare payments. And more importantly, criminal prosecutions are very rare. So let's now talk about the difference between legal and illegal ways to avoid paying your taxes. Corporations pay lawyers and accountants to figure out creative ways to avoid paying taxes. Corporations pay lobbyists to influence Congress to make tax laws more flexible. Corporations move their base of operations to countries with low or no business taxes. Almost 2/3 of American corporations paid no taxes at the end of the 1990s. So when we talk about corporate tax rates and how, corporations are always talking about how they pay such high tax rates, they are complaining about nothing. The vast majority of taxes in this country are paid by personal income earned by the middle class. So, the vast majority of these, large corporations get away without paying taxes because they've pay very high fees to accountants and lawyers to figure out ways to avoid paying tax. Because tax evasion is illegal, tax avoidance is totally legal. And you can do it in other countries too. In 2012, Starbucks paid no corporate tax in Britain, despite generating sales of nearly $630 million from more than 700 stores in that country. In 2012, Apple, despite being the most profitable American technology company, avoided an estimated $10 billion tax bill in the United States and around the world through a web of complex subsidiaries. So what you see here is that avoiding taxes is really the key to being a successful business. Having a great product, having a terrific marketing team, having a terrific advertising concept, all of these are great ideas. But what you really need is a terrific accountant, a terrific lawyer who can figure out how to avoid paying taxes. Another issue that we see in corporate crime is price fixing. And price fixing is when competing corporations join together and agree to certain levels of pricing, which negates the laws of supply and demand. Price fixing has been found to exist in the following industries. I know the list is a little long. Gasoline and oil, diamonds, soda, airline tickets, hotel rooms, infant formula, milk contracts at schools, vitamins, shoes, video games, especially with Nintendo. The list could go on and on. These are some of the specific travel companies that were thought that have been proven to be in collusion with each other. Ultimately, what we see here is that this free market capitalism is not free market, and the idea of profit is really more like greed, because profit based on supply and demand is an honest profit. Profit based on greed and fraud is a crime. Price gouging is systematically overcharging for products with the manipulation of supply and demand. This mostly happens in the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical companies have successfully lobbied to eliminate Americans having access to foreign pharmaceutical companies, which reduces their competition. So, for example, in this country, you may pay $55 for a prescription of a certain antibiotic. Well, you go to Canada, and the same prescription is $5 because they have a different way of pricing things in Canada. Now, what they used to do is you could mail order and get your meds from Canada. Well, that got eliminated because that was horrifying to American pharmaceutical companies that they could lose profit. In other industries, you can see price gouging such as auto rentals, meat, oil and gasoline, and infant formula. After Superstorm Sandy, a particular truck stop in New York and Brooklyn increased their prices for gasoline 88%. So only in America would you see, during a crisis, the desire to gouge people of their money during probably one of the worst days of their life. Another issue we often see is false advertising. Beechnut Corporation pled guilty to marketing apple juice for babies. It was actually a combination of 3 different kinds of sugar: beet sugar, cane sugar, and corn syrup, and it barely contained any apple juice. They were fined $2 million. Now look at this picture, made with all natural ingredients. No, it was made with 3 kinds of sugar. Corporations have been known to exploit their employees and cheat them out of their pay. So recently, Chicky and Pete's were fined almost $7 million for taking the tips, underpaying servers, and not paying overtime, and not keeping accurate records. Walmart cheated employees out of millions of dollars by forcing them to clock out so they wouldn't have to pay overtime, but still required them to work. Now, a lot of you might say, well, heck, I would walk out. But here's the thing, a lot of these people are desperate. And when you work in a town where the only jobs available are Walmart, that's what you're going to have to do. Another corporate crime is accounting fraud, and this is the misrepresentation of financial statements. Major cases have involved, and we've talked about most of these, Enron, Adelphia Communications, Health South, WorldCom, Tyco, and Bristol Myers. Accounting fraud will bring your company down if you're caught. This cartoon is one of my favorites. Numbers tell the story, folks. Once you reward your accounting firm for lying, wonderful things happen. It is a sad tale, but even accountants can be bought. Finally, we have conflict of interest. When a public office holder or business executive has personal interests that might benefit from his or her official actions or influence. So business executives at Enron who got stock options engaged in a pump and dump scheme, meaning these business executives knew that Enron stock would be worthless. So they told the folks who sold the stock that it was going to go up, 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 so they had to pump it up and sell it. So they said it was great, it was awesome, and they should sell it, and they did. And the executives walked away with millions of dollars, and the investors walked away with a big pile of steaming crap. An elected official gets a large political donation if he or she votes a certain way on a bill. This is a conflict of interest. It is a quid pro quo. So, again, what you see here is this conflict of interest is very prevalent. It is fraud. It is a way of manipulating the system. And again, what it all boils down to is that when you have a free market capitalist system where supply and demand is being manipulated and profit is not honestly being determined, you have thrown the entire system out into the garbage, and now you're just working with a criminal enterprise. So, on that happy note, I'm going to end this presentation. If you have any questions, please text or email me, and I hope you have a fabulous day. Thank you.